Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Think diesel, think deforestation, think agriculture, all major contributors to pollution and hence climate change. But how many people these days mention coal? As the latest UN conference on global warming approaches, why are so many countries unwilling to address what is arguably the biggest culprit there is? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. And if those countries that are the biggest coal polluters argue we can't afford to live without coal, what can be done to persuade them that they must make changes? The latest major report from the United Nations has put the world on red alert. The damage done from global warming is already here and is going to get much worse in the coming decades. Last month, leaders from more than 50 countries met in London to tackle climate change issues. It was the first such in-person meeting in 18 months. The 2 days of discussions ended with one key issue, left without full agreement by everyone: the end of coal power. Coal is the most polluting energy source if emissions are not captured and then stored underground. Alok Sharma, president of COP26, the latest climate change conference, said, "We weren't able to get every country to agree to phasing out coal power, which was very disappointing. Unless we get all countries signed up to a coal phase out, keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius in reach is going to be extremely difficult." COP26 will be looking to address recent extreme weather conditions across the globe. Many countries are already ambitious in terms of trying to reverse climate change, but critics argue that others are acting too slowly. With only 3 months until the summit, how ready are world leaders to phase out coal? I'm very pleased to be able to say that joining us on Roundtable out of Warsaw in Poland, Joanna Pandera, Chief Exec at Forum Energii. That's a think tank that focuses on energy transition. Then we go to Bristol in the UK and we see Leo Roberts, Research Manager on Fossil Fuel Transitions at E3G. Part of his job, coal diplomacy. I'll ask him what that means. And in Surrey, also in the UK, Alison Doig, Climate Change Consultant at the Wellcome Trust. Welcome back. Alison, thank you very much for joining us, all three of you. Joanna, let me ask you first of all, since you are in Poland and Poland is very dependent still on coal, to explain the situation there. Is Poland trying to come off this fossil fuel or not?
In Poland is indeed the third country, biggest country, one of the biggest countries in the world, the third one most dependent on coal. So actually we still produce 70% of our electricity from coal, and it's not only power sector which uses coal, but also heating sector, and not only district heating, but also the challenge which we have is burning coal in the single households in order to heat them. So the challenge for Poland is really huge as we consume a lot of coal. And what has changed over the last few years is that we started to speak about phasing out coal. And there are many reasons why we do so. The first reason is that Poland for many years was actually not dependent on any other country when it comes to fuel and energy security. Now it is changing rapidly because we are running of coal, of good quality coal, and imports, including from Russia, are increasing. So this is the first reason which is pushing Poland to phase out coal, but also CO2 prices.
Can I ask you this? I want to know how serious Poland is about phasing out coal. If it is so dependent on it, how much is it trying not to use it any longer?
It is serious. So what we have now in place is agreement between trade unions and government to phase out coal. It's still many years ahead because it's 2049. So there is a lot of critics in Poland that this process is just too long, will take too long, and it would mean that state and other members of the society should support basically the miners. There is no agreement on this, but this process is just taking place. It's completely new. I mean, phasing out coal. It's new, but this is taking place. The question is when Poland will phase out coal, and in our view, as we are dealing with the topic for many years, it's the latest 2035, where Poland is able to phase out coal both from district heating and power sector.
Okay, so we're talking roughly 14, 15 years, if that all works. And I gather there's a suggestion there could be some societal unrest as this changeover is made. Leo, let me come to you. Coal diplomacy, one of your titles. What is that?
So, I mean, we can start with the obvious stuff. Coal is absolutely central to climate change, to efforts to stem climate change. Particularly efforts to hit climate targets of 1.5 degrees Celsius to keep anthropogenic climate change below dangerous levels. What that means is that we need to see countries working really closely together, progressive countries pushing from the front and supporting countries that are struggling to be able to deliver a transition away from coal. So coal diplomacy is effectively working with countries and countries working with other countries and international organizations, the UN Secretary General, organizations like the Powering Past Coal Alliance, collectively working together to try to support countries to be able to move everybody faster so that we have a better chance of hitting.
So with what
targets.
Joanna has just said, Poland being extremely dependent on coal, trying not to be, how much support is that country getting from others that are perhaps in a more luxurious position when it comes to switching their energy sources?
It's a really good question. So the range of situations that countries around the world find themselves in apropos coal and the energy transition is huge. So at one end, you have countries like the UK that in 2012, 40% of the UK's electricity came from coal. It's now 1%. So a country that's got a relatively high GDP and has been able to make this shift quickly. Then you've got countries like Poland, which are further down in the GDP rankings and have a much deeper set of coal entanglement. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got countries in the global south who have similar levels of coal entanglement. They burn a lot of coal, they mine a lot of coal, lots of jobs are in coal, and they have way less capacity and capability financially, economically to be able to make these changes. So,
and how much help are they getting?
Currently, some, but not enough, would be, I think, the prudent answer. So, you know, this links well to the conversations about the $100 billion per year climate finance target that was set in 2015, and whether that can be achieved. These will no doubt come up at COP26. There are efforts going on, private finance and public finance. Lots of development assistance is going into supporting countries, but at the moment it's still very early stages, and the scales of capital that we're seeing aren't significant enough to be able to support countries like South Africa, for example, that have a huge degree of coal entanglement, loads of jobs in coal, and a real structural transformation to be able to deliver.
You know, you mentioned a short while ago at the beginning of your answer what the UK had managed to achieve. I was going to play in a clip of Alok Sharma, who's Britain's coordinator of COP26, saying exactly the same thing that you just said. So I won't bother since you've stamped it on the programme already. And I'm going to go to Alison and ask you, Alison, this is not just about climate change. It's also a health matter, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. So coal burning contributes to air pollution. Air pollution causes over 7 million deaths globally. Over 7 million deaths, and malaria kills less than 1 million a year. It is one of the major killers, air pollution, of causes of premature death, people dying early. And coal is a major contributing factor. You see that when you look at cities in India or China where that smog sits around. I'm sure within Poland it'd be interesting to look at that, but it's heavy in the air. When I was in Katowice for the climate conference, you could smell coal in the air. And it is basically, coal is not a modern future technology. It's one that's actually causing great harm. It's causing great harm to the climate, and it's causing great harm directly. So put it another way, if we make this shift to clean technology, we're actually directly saving lives. Not just by stopping climate change and the superheat and the migration of disease and all the health implications of climate change, but by moving away from dirty fuels to the clean fuels, we're actually going to directly save millions of premature people from dying early and from the ill health that goes with it. So
Well,
you can look at it in
shall we
way.
go back to Poland at this point, since you mentioned what it was like for you in
Yeah.
Katowice, and ask Joanna what daily life can be like with all the heavy coal use?
So indeed, I think that the challenge is removing coal in the first place from the burning it in inefficient house stoves. This is really a challenge because almost half of the coal is used in the heating sector in Poland, and it contributes.
And do people get sick
to the
because
huge
of
air
the
pollution?
pollution
People
in the
get
air?
sick. And this is really now the huge challenge. So getting rid of coal, but not sticking to gas, because once Poland is phasing out coal, we cannot forget that gas is also not the best fuel to use, as this is fossil and this is also emitting CO2. So Poland now has a challenge how to move from coal, not phasing gas. Gas is still quite limited. And once you mention actually UK has actually already a huge share of gas, but also nuclear energy. We do not have nuclear energy. We don't have
But
actually gas in the
I do believe
power
that Poland
sector.
is going to be encouraged to switch to nuclear energy. It might get financial help from the European Union for that.
I don't think that nuclear can be supported with the EU funds, as this is not the technology. There are state aid rules, and this is complicated. So, in fact, it should be really market-oriented project. Poland is interested in nuclear, but it's actually declining technology. So there are less and less technology providers who can be really competitive in that context.
Okay, let's go to Leo and ask you, and then Alison, I'll throw this one at you as well, and ask you about COP26. It's coming up in the autumn in this country. Alok Sharma, as I said, he's been talking about what the UK has managed to do. What is the UK's goal when it comes to coal at the climate change conference this year?
So it's a good question. Alok Sharma has used the phrase, this needs to be the COP that heralds the end of coal. So the UK recognises that coal, as the dirtiest, most polluting fossil fuel, needs to be right up there at COP this year. This needs to be the COP that recognises that coal is on its way out. What that means in practice is that we need to see a ratcheting up of ambition. So as things stand, NDCs has put nationally determined contributions, which are the offers put on the table by countries, what they're going to do to reduce their emissions, are not even close to sufficient to get us to the 1.5 degree target. So we need to see more ambition from countries. That means retiring coal plants earlier, for which many countries will need financial support, and also scrapping pipelines, cancelling all new projects. We need to see no new coal, and we need to see the number of countries committing to not build a new coal power station massively.
Let me ask you about this, because although Joanna talks about the fact that Poland is heavily dependent on coal, she says third by a certain proportion. The heaviest users of coal are China and the United States. Are either of those countries making significant reductions in their usage?
So the US is a great example. Actually, in spite of Trump's rhetoric over his term that he would bring back coal, more coal power stations closed, or I should say coal power stations closed faster under Trump's terms than under Obama's. And with Biden's target for a net zero energy system by 2035, we're likely to see coal offline in the US fully by 2030, if not then, soon after. So it would be great to see a public commitment on that to hit that 2030 target.
What about China?
China is a more complicated case. Broadly, you can split the world into three separate groups. There are OECD countries. They're broadly getting off coal and they're not building new coal, with a few exceptions in Japan, Turkey, that are still considering new coal. Then you have non-OECD countries, excluding China. So that's Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Africa. Most of them are scrapping their pipelines because they're also realizing the economics are really terrible for coal. Then you have a third group, which is China, as you rightly point out. So China is host to half the world's operating coal and half of the world's pipeline of new projects. China is being watched closely and is aware that it's being watched, and pressure is being heaped on China by the international community through diplomatic channels. And we're all just hoping that we will see some progress.
Well, we will have to wait and see, because China sometimes doesn't respond very well to being put under pressure. I'll come back and ask you what the result of it in terms of the coal diplomacy is in just a moment. But let me read this from Barbara Pompili, who's France's environment minister. It's now time for the world to define the tools that will allow us to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming after more than a year of a health crisis. This first physical meeting in London, and this was the preparatory meeting to COP, was an essential step for jolting the international community into action. We are 100 days away from COP. The countdown is on. So, Alison, are those taking part in this doing enough, in your opinion, at this late stage before the latest conference?
Yeah, what I think we're seeing is a real step shift in the politics. We're making massive progress in politics. And I'd say the UK government, Alex Sharma, is really rallying the troops. Those progressive countries are on board, putting more and more pressure on some of the laggards. China's, you're rightly saying, is being reluctant in coming forward with new statements. What we've found in the past, though, with China is they've undercommitted but overperformed on climate change. So they aim low, but actually they'll move more quickly. So there's a little bit of hope that they'll come up. But what we're lacking, what we're utterly lacking, we've got political progress, but actually real world change is lagging way behind. The speed we need to go on the IPCC, the scientific body that tells us how far we've got to go, is going to release its next scientific report on Monday, and it will say we've got an incredibly short period to stop climate change, to stop the greenhouse gases before we tip over that 1.5. So the speed of real world change is very slow. So you've got a country like the UK that was moving out of coal anyway, it's committing to powering past coal, but it's still promoting oil and gas in the North Sea. It's getting new permits into there. So on the one hand, it's doing what it can do, what it clearly can do in the short term, but it's not really making that dramatic change that's needed to speed past. And the developing world is seeing this and saying, look, come on, guys, yeah, all this nice rhetoric, but actually, where's the real world change? So I think politics is moving right. Real world economy needs to really catch up and overtake.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back to Joanna. And Joanna, if you want to talk about anything other than the country in which you are, please do so. But I want to ask you about the coal lobby, those who make plenty of money from promoting this fossil fuel in Poland. The pressure is also coming from them not to have their income source redefined.
Indeed, it is the story of the past, in my view. So coal lobby is now playing a really smaller role than it was in the past. So what we can see in Poland now is actually the fear of decision makers, how to gain the acceptance of the society and how to perform all the change which is required. So we may not forget only power and heating sector. We need to reduce emission from buildings and transport. So the discussion which awaits us now is basically how to encourage society that they will be able to pay more, and how not to increase energy poverty, and how to keep the acceptance for climate change.
How do you think then you persuade the Polish people? Do you tell them that it's bad for the world, that it's bad for Poland in the long run, or do you tell them individually, look, this is a fuel that is killing you?
Certainly, Polish society is now seeing climate change. So once you ask the society in polls, you can see that climate change is mentioned as one of the biggest global threats. So there is, on one hand, climate change, but on the other hand, there are also economic reason why we need to reduce coal, because we don't want to subsidize forever this unprofitable industry. So that's the one reason, but also clean air certainly is another reason why Polish society is much more interested in environment protection than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay. Leo, I know you said to one of my producers that there was something that the world is missing out on when it comes to certain restrictions. What did you mean by that?
If you don't mind, I just want to go back to something Alison said, which is around real world momentum. I completely agree that when it comes to oil and gas emissions reductions, that's the case. But I'd just like to say that I think in coal, we're really seeing a global structural transformation in the real world. We're also seeing political momentum, but the two of them aren't quite linking up. So in half of the world already, it's more expensive to keep an existing coal power station running than it is to build a brand new solar PV plant or wind farm. And that's going to be the whole world within the next 8-9 years. So the economics are so heavily stacked against coal that we are seeing a real world transformation.
But are we perhaps taking our eye off the ball? I know the main thrust of COP26 in Scotland is coal, coal, coal. But are we taking our eye off the ball elsewhere when there are other things that perhaps should be addressed that aren't being addressed?
So I think the answer to that is that the energy transition needs to be seen as a whole. Coal needs to be got offline as quickly as possible. Retirements need to happen of existing plants, and no new plants can be built. That's essential if we want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. But while we're thinking about that, and while we're pushing for that, while that's being funded and delivered, we need to be thinking about what comes next. So Joanna raised this point in Poland, and replacing coal with oil or gas is a temporary solution and not one which will help us get to a 1.5 degree target.
But people in Poland have to have power from somewhere. So where do you think they should get it from? Joanna was suggesting that nuclear is not necessarily an option. Is it in terms of sort of free to live, if you like, you know, the wind, the sun, whatever?
So I wouldn't hazard to speak to Poland specifically on this, but I would say that around the world we're increasingly seeing very effective energy mixes which are heavily based on renewables, and the undermining of the concept of baseload, that you need this stable, gigantic macro project the size of a coal power station to be able to run an effective energy system. Modern resilient energy systems, they can flex, they can adjust. So when the sun shines in one place and the wind's blowing in another, and in a third area neither of them are happening, the system can adapt. In some countries in the global south, there may be scope for gas or nuclear to help the systems get over the line. But
okay, so we're becoming much more flexible as a world. Alison, let me ask you about the politicians, because I've been to many donor conferences after natural disasters. You see lots of pledges, the money doesn't always arrive. Here we're seeing politicians talking about long-term goals as opposed to something that needs to be done tomorrow, because what needs to be done tomorrow can bring political pain. Are you seeing that a bit here?
Yeah, I think a lot of the countries are being pulled along and taken on board, but they're saying we'll be net zero by 2050. They are very much pushing it into the long grass. And they are saying we're going to use carbon capture and storage. It's a technology not proven. Or the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, likes to use jet zero. We're all going to have biofuel planes. These are all technologies we don't have. Whereas what we're hearing here is we have technologies here and now. We have renewable energies. We have efficient homes. I mean, our homes are one of the most leaky in terms of energy systems that we have. So there are so many things that are within our grasp that we can do right now. Whereas I think things like the long distance net zero is sort of pushing both technology and emissions reductions into the future. And I think sometimes it's a bit of a bluff. And what that adds in is
what we need to hear from the politicians is we're actually going to do something not just tomorrow, but almost yesterday. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Poland again. We're coming towards the end of this discussion. I found it absolutely fascinating. And if I can come back to you, Joanna, and ask you about your hopes for your country for the future. Do you think it can be coal-free? Do you think it can be a healthier place for your children, other people's children, their grandchildren, and so on?
I think that there is really no other option. So, of course, we can sit and complain about the future, but we can also see a lot of opportunities which emerge from modern energy sector. And I believe that this coal gap can be effectively filled with mainly renewables, with maybe some share of gas, as we need this flexibility, which was mentioned at this stage. So I think it's a really huge opportunity for Poland, also in terms of the EU funds and of basically investments which need to take place. And I have the feeling that once Poland, as the really very coal-dependent country, will manage it, then any other developing countries also can do the same. So I have the feeling that Poland is not only important for Poles, but also for the global energy transition.
And when it comes to those who might suffer because of Poland's shift away from coal. I'm thinking about the miners, you mentioned them earlier, and when that happened in this country back in the 1980s, there was a great deal of social unrest. Can that kind of friction be prevented? Can Poland pull with it those people at the moment whose livelihoods depend on coal?
I think that there is, at this stage, there's really not a problem. Poland has an unemployment rate at the level of 4%. So it is the lowest in our history, I think. So I believe that miners can really find their place. And we may not forget that also there is Just Transition Fund, which was prepared by the European Commission. So basically regions in Poland now, post-coal regions or steel coal regions, they are preparing for just transition. So there are many ideas, a lot of projects which can really help to overcome this shift for the region. So I believe that just transition will take place in Poland.
Thank you so much for coming on this edition of Roundtable. So it's over to COP26 come the autumn, and goodbye, you hope, to coal. Thank you very much for coming on the programme wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. We thank you for your time and your interest. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, until next time, goodbye.